At 6:15 on the morning of June 5, 1944, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel climbed into the back seat of his Horch staff car at Chateau La Roche-Guyon, 50 kilometers northwest of Paris. His aide-de-camp, Captain Helmuth Lang, sat beside him. In Rommel's hands was a small package wrapped in paper, a pair of grey suede shoes, size 5.5, purchased in Paris the week before. The shoes were a birthday present for his wife, Lucy. Her 50th birthday was the next day, June 6th. Rommel had not seen her in months. He had been working 18-hour days, driving himself and his men relentlessly, inspecting every bunker and gun emplacement along 800 miles of coastline. The weather outside was miserable. Rain lashing the windows, winds howling across the Seine Valley. No invasion could possibly come in weather like this. His chief of staff, Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, bid him farewell at the chateau entrance. Speidel had hosted guests for dinner the night before, not retiring until 1 in the morning. The atmosphere at headquarters was relaxed. The German meteorologists had issued their forecast. The bad weather would continue for at least 2 weeks. An invasion in early June was impossible. What Rommel did not know was that in the next 36 hours, everything he had predicted, everything he had warned his superiors about, would come true. The Allies would land. Germany would have exactly 24 hours to stop them, and Rommel would be 600 kilometers away, watching his wife open a pair of grey suede shoes, while the largest military operation in human history unfolded on the beaches he was supposed to be defending. Erwin Rommel had said it plainly, just 6 weeks earlier. Standing on a deserted beach in Normandy on April 22, 1944, he had turned to Captain Lang and pointed his marshal's baton at the sand beneath their feet. "The war will be won or lost on the beaches," Rommel declared. "We will have only one chance to stop the enemy, and that is while he is in the water, struggling to get ashore. Reserves will never get up to the point of attack in time. It is foolish even to consider them. The main line of resistance must be here, right at the water's edge. Everything we have must be on the coast." Rommel paused, staring out at the grey waters of the English Channel. The wind whipped at his greatcoat. An old muffler was wrapped around his throat. In his hand was the marshal's baton he preferred to his official one, a 2-foot-long silver-topped black stick with a red, black and white tassel. He turned to Lang with an intensity that bordered on desperation. "Believe me, Lang," he said, "the first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. The fate of Germany depends on the outcome. For the Allies, as well as Germany, it will be the longest day." Lang never forgot those words. Neither did anyone else who heard Rommel speak them. The field marshal understood something that his superiors in Berlin refused to accept. Once the Allies established a beachhead, once they got tanks and artillery ashore, once they linked their landing zones together, Germany would never dislodge them. The only chance was to destroy the invasion in its first hours, while the soldiers were still wading through the surf, while the landing craft were still grinding onto the sand, while everything was chaos and confusion and vulnerability. 24 hours. That was the window. After that, the war in the West would be lost. The problem was that almost no one in the German High Command agreed with Rommel about how to use that window, and the man who disagreed most sharply was the officer who outranked him. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was the supreme commander in the West, and he had a very different vision of how to defeat the invasion. Rundstedt was 68 years old, a career soldier from an aristocratic Prussian family, a veteran of the First World War and the campaigns against Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. He was the elder statesman of the German officer corps, respected and feared in equal measure. Rundstedt believed in the classic doctrine of mobile defense that had served Germany so well in the early years of the war. Let the Allies land. Let them commit their forces. Let them reveal where their main thrust was directed. Then unleash the panzer divisions in a massive counterattack, a concentrated armoured fist that would smash through the enemy lines and drive them back into the sea. This was how Germany had destroyed entire Soviet armies on the Eastern Front. This was orthodox German military thinking. Rundstedt wanted the armoured reserves held back, concentrated around Paris and other central locations, ready to strike in any direction once the invasion's true location became clear. Moving the panzers to the coast too early, he argued, would spread them thin across hundreds of miles of coastline. It would dissipate their striking power. It would make them vulnerable to Allied air and naval bombardment before they could mass for a decisive blow. Rommel thought this was suicide. He had fought the British and Americans in North Africa for 2 years. He had felt the devastating power of Allied air superiority firsthand. He had watched his supply convoys bombed to twisted wreckage. He had seen his tank columns strafed until the roads were littered with burning vehicles. He knew what happened when the enemy controlled the skies. Any armoured reserve held inland would be destroyed from the air long before it could reach the coast, Rommel argued. The panzers had to be positioned close to the beaches, ready to counterattack within hours, not days. Every moment of delay would give the Allies time to consolidate. Every mile the tanks had to travel in daylight would cost them vehicles and men. The battle would be decided in the first morning. If the tanks were still sitting near Paris when the Allied soldiers hit the sand, they might as well not exist. The two field marshals argued for months. Rundstedt dismissed Rommel as an upstart, a favourite of Hitler who had been promoted beyond his abilities. Rommel considered Rundstedt a relic of the last war who did not understand modern combat. Neither would yield. Their staffs clashed repeatedly. The command structure in France became a tangle of conflicting authorities and competing doctrines. And because neither could convince the other, and because Adolf Hitler trusted neither of them completely, the final decision went to Hitler himself. The Führer would decide how to use the panzers. Hitler's solution was a compromise that satisfied no one. He split the armoured forces. 3 panzer divisions were assigned to Rommel's Army Group B and placed near the coast. 3 more went to Army Group G in southern France, and 4 of the best armoured divisions, including the elite 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and the powerful Panzer Lehr Division, were held back in a central reserve under General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg's Panzer Group West. But here was the fatal catch. The reserve divisions could not move without Hitler's personal authorization. Not Rundstedt's approval, not Rommel's request, not Schweppenberg's judgment. Only the Führer himself could release the panzers. The order had to come from Hitler's lips. No matter where he was, no matter what time it was, no matter what else was happening. This meant that when the invasion came, the most powerful armoured force in France would be paralysed until one man in a mountain retreat in Bavaria decided to wake up and give the order. Rommel knew this was madness. He protested repeatedly. He travelled to Berchtesgaden to argue his case personally. He demanded that the armoured reserves be placed under his command. He wrote memos. He made phone calls. He argued, he pleaded, he raged, but Hitler would not budge. The Führer trusted no one enough to give them control of the decisive reserves. He would make the call himself when the time came. The panzers stayed where they were, and Rommel was left to do what he could with the forces he controlled. What Rommel did in the 6 months before D-Day was remarkable by any military standard. When he first arrived in France in November 1943, to inspect the Atlantic Wall, he found the defences in shambles. The fortifications that Nazi propaganda had trumpeted as impregnable were riddled with gaps. Entire stretches of coastline had no obstacles, no mines, no concrete bunkers. Gun emplacements were exposed to air attack. Fields of fire overlapped poorly or not at all. Rommel later described the Atlantic Wall as something out of Cloud Cuckoo Land, a fantasy dreamed up by propagandists who had never seen actual combat. The wall was mostly a fiction, impressive on paper but hollow in reality. Rommel threw himself into the work with furious energy. He was 52 years old, stocky and weathered, with the intensity of a man who knew exactly how little time he had. He drove his men relentlessly, visiting every sector, demanding progress reports, inspecting every bunker and gun emplacement personally. His staff car covered thousands of kilometres. He was on the road by 4:30 every morning, often not returning until after dark. To his engineer expert, Major General Wilhelm Meser, Rommel outlined what he wanted. "I want anti-personnel mines, anti-tank mines, anti-paratroop mines," he said. "I want mines to sink ships and mines to sink landing craft. I want mines that detonate when a wire is tripped, mines that explode when a wire is cut, mines that can be remote controlled, mines that will blow up when a beam of light is interrupted." He told Miser he wanted 50 million mines planted along the coast. It was an impossible number, but Rommel did not care about possible. He cared about stopping the invasion. Under his direction, the pace of construction exploded. In the first 4 months of 1944, more than 4,600 new fortifications were erected along the French coast, adding to the 8,400 already built in the previous 3 years. The construction rate doubled, then doubled again. Workers from the TOT organization labored around the clock. By June, more than 5 million mines had been laid in northern France. Rommel had wanted 50 million, but 5 million was still an enormous number. It was more mines than the Germans had laid on the entire Eastern Front. Rommel ordered 500,000 obstacles placed on the beaches. Steel hedgehogs, jagged constructions of welded girders that could rip the bottom out of a landing craft. Wooden stakes driven into the sand at angles, often topped with mines. Belgian gates, heavy steel structures 9 feet high and 9 feet wide. Iron beams called Czech hedgehogs. Concrete pyramids called tetrahedra. The obstacles were positioned to be underwater at high tide, invisible to incoming boats until it was too late. Many were fitted with contact mines. Others had shells mounted on poles, designed to explode when struck by a landing craft's hull. Inland, Rommel flooded low-lying areas to trap paratroopers. He dammed rivers and streams, turning meadows into shallow lakes. He planted fields with sharpened poles, stakes 10 feet tall, driven into the ground at angles, and connected by wires. The troops called them Rommel's asparagus. Some were topped with mines or artillery shells. Gliders trying to land in those fields would be torn apart. He positioned artillery batteries to create overlapping fields of fire across the beaches. He strengthened the concrete bunkers, protecting the guns. He expanded the trench systems connecting the strongpoints. He installed machine gun nests with interlocking arcs of fire. Rommel turned the Normandy coast into a death trap. Any soldier who survived the journey across the Channel would have to navigate a maze of underwater obstacles, wade through surf under murderous fire, cross beaches strewn with mines and barbed wire, assault concrete bunkers bristling with weapons, and then face counterattack from armoured forces waiting just inland. It was a formidable defence, but it was not enough. It would never be enough. Rommel had wanted 50 million mines. He got 1/10 of that. He wanted 6 rows of beach obstacles. By June, only 3 were in place. He wanted the panzer divisions at the water's edge. They remained miles inland, waiting for orders that would have to come from Hitler. Time was the enemy Rommel could not defeat. Every day that passed without the invasion was another day to strengthen the defences. Every day the Allies delayed was a gift. But Rommel knew the gift would not last forever. Spring was turning to summer. The weather would clear. The tides would align. And then the blow would fall. He spoke to one of his division commanders in late May. "If we cannot defeat the enemy in the first hours," Rommel said, "we will not defeat him at all. Everything depends on stopping them at the water's edge. Once they establish themselves ashore, it is over." In the first week of June 1944, Rommel was exhausted. He had been working at a punishing pace for months. His health was suffering. He missed his family desperately. His wife, Lucy, and his son, Manfred, now 15 years old, were waiting for him at their home in Herlingen, a small village in the Swabian Alps. And now, as June began, the weather in the English Channel turned foul. Storms lashed the coast. Winds gusted to 30 miles per hour. The seas were too rough for any landing operation. Waves crashed against the beaches with a fury that made any amphibious assault unthinkable. The German meteorologists issued their forecast. The bad weather would continue for at least 2 weeks. An invasion in early June was impossible. The next feasible window for an attack would not come until late June, when the tides and moon would again be favourable. Rommel looked at the forecast and made a decision. He would go home to Germany, celebrate Lucy's birthday on June 6th, and then travel to Berchtesgaden to meet with Hitler on June 7th. He needed to convince the Führer, one more time, to release the panzer reserves to his command. It was his last chance to prepare for the invasion properly. His chief of staff, Hans Speidel, bid him farewell on the morning of June 5th. The weather was miserable, exactly as the meteorologists had predicted. Rain pelted the windows of the chateau. The wind bent the trees in the garden. No invasion could come in conditions like this. Rommel would be back by June 8th, he told Speidel. There was plenty of time, except there was not. What the German meteorologists could not see, what they had no way of knowing, was that the weather was about to change. The Allies had captured weather stations in the North Atlantic that the Germans had lost. They had data from ships and aircraft positions the Germans did not have. And that data showed a brief window of acceptable weather opening on the morning of June 6th. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Allied Supreme Commander, had already postponed the invasion by 1 day because of the storms. His fleet was at sea, thousands of ships carrying 156,000 men. They could not stay there indefinitely. The men were cramped, seasick, anxious. The tide windows would not align again for 2 weeks. A decision had to be made. At 4:15 on the morning of June 5th, Eisenhower met with his commanders at Southwick House near Portsmouth. His chief meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, delivered the forecast. The weather would clear enough on June 6th to permit the invasion. The window would be brief. The seas would still be rough. Cloud cover would hamper air operations, but it would be good enough. Eisenhower sat in silence for a long moment. Every eye in the room was on him. The weight of the decision was crushing. If he launched the invasion and the weather worsened, the result could be catastrophic. Landing craft could be swamped, air support could be grounded, the assault could fail with terrible casualties. But if he postponed again, he would have to recall the fleet, which was already at sea. Troops would have to be unloaded and reloaded, secrecy would be compromised, morale would suffer, and there was no guarantee the next weather window would be any better. Eisenhower made the call. "Okay," he said quietly. "We'll go." The invasion would proceed on June 6th. While Rommel drove through the German countryside toward his home in Hurlingen, while he watched the rain streak across his car windows and thought about his wife's birthday, 5,000 ships were already churning across the English Channel. 11,000 aircraft were preparing for the greatest air operation in history. 156,000 men were loading weapons, checking equipment, saying prayers. The largest amphibious invasion in human history was underway, and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the one German commander who understood exactly what was about to happen and how to stop it, was not there. The first warning came shortly after midnight, on June 6, 1944. Paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions began dropping into Normandy, west of the landing beaches. They were scattered by high winds and ground fire, landing miles from their intended drop zones. Some drowned in flooded fields. Others were shot as they descended. But thousands survived and began organizing to seize key bridges and road junctions. At the eastern end of the invasion zone, British paratroopers from the 6th Airborne Division landed with greater precision. Their primary objective was the bridges over the Orne River and the Caen Canal. At 12:16 in the morning, gliders carrying D Company of the 2nd Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry crashed into the fields beside the canal bridge, later famous as Pegasus Bridge. Within 10 minutes, the bridge was in British hands. At Chateau La Roche-Guyon, Hans Speidel received reports of the airborne landings. He had retired late after hosting guests for dinner, not expecting any crisis. Now the phone was ringing with fragmentary, confusing reports. Paratroopers were landing. But where? How many? Was this the real invasion or a feint? The news was chaotic. Dummy parachutists had been dropped in various locations to spread confusion. Simple fabric figures with firecrackers attached to simulate gunfire. German commanders could not tell which reports were real and which were diversions. Some reported thousands of paratroopers in areas where only dummies had landed. Others dismissed genuine airborne landings as false alarms. Speidel telephoned the headquarters of Field Marshal von Rundstedt in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, near Paris. The staff there was uncertain. Was this the real invasion or a diversion? The Allies had been conducting elaborate deception operations for months. The most extensive was Operation Fortitude, which had convinced German intelligence that the main blow would fall at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. The Germans believed a phantom army group under General George Patton was massing in southeastern England, directly opposite Calais. Fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks, and double agents had sold the deception completely. Even now, with paratroopers landing in Normandy, many German commanders believed this was just a feint. The real attack, they assumed, would come at Calais. At the same time, the German 15th Army's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Colonel Helmuth Meyer, was listening to a radio intercept that should have told the Germans everything they needed to know. The BBC had broadcast a coded message to the French resistance, lines from a poem by Paul Verlaine, a 19th-century French poet. Les sanglots longs des violons de l'automne blessant mon cœur d'une langueur monotone. The long sobs of autumn's violins wound my heart with monotonous languor. Meyer knew what this meant. German intelligence had been warned months earlier by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, that this poem would signal the invasion. The first 3 lines, broadcast on June 1st, meant the invasion was coming within 2 weeks. The second half, broadcast on the evening of June 5th, meant the invasion would begin within 48 hours. Meyer rushed to inform his superiors. He burst into the dining room where General Hans von Salmuth, commander of the 15th Army, was playing bridge with his staff. "General," Meyer said breathlessly, "the message, the second part, it's here." Von Salmuth considered for a moment, then ordered his troops to full alert. But as Meyer hurried out of the room, von Salmuth was already turning back to his cards. "I'm too old a bunny," he said, "to get excited by this." Crucially, the 7th Army, which was responsible for the Normandy sector where the actual invasion was occurring, was not alerted. The message went to the wrong army. The 15th Army was at Pas-de-Calais, where no invasion would come. The 7th Army, spread thin across Normandy, received no warning. And at the Berghof, Adolf Hitler's mountain retreat near Berchtesgaden, no one did anything at all. Hitler had stayed up late on the evening of June 5th, as was his habit. He watched newsreels with his entourage. He held forth on his favourite subjects, the great men of history, the future of Europe, his plans for the post-war world. Eva Braun, his mistress, was at his side. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost festive. Hitler retired to bed around 3 in the morning. His personal physician had given him sleeping pills. He would not wake easily. When the first reports of the paratroop landings reached the German High Command, the Führer was sound asleep, and no one dared wake him. General Alfred Jodl, the chief of operations at the Wehrmacht High Command, received urgent calls from Rundstedt's headquarters throughout the early morning hours. The reports were increasingly alarming. This was not a small-scale raid. Thousands of paratroopers had landed. Naval radar was detecting massive ship movements in the Channel. Something enormous was happening. Rundstedt wanted to release the armoured reserves immediately. He had already ordered the 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division to begin moving toward Normandy, acting on his own authority because time was critical. But he knew he had exceeded his powers. Only Hitler could authorize the use of the Panzer Group West reserves. Rundstedt needed that authorization, and he needed it now. Jodl hesitated. He was not convinced the Normandy landings were the main attack. He still believed Pas-de-Calais was the real target, just as the intelligence had suggested, just as the build-up of Patton's Phantom Army seemed to indicate. Perhaps these paratroopers were just a diversion, meant to draw German forces away from where the real blow would fall. And even if Jodl had been certain this was the main invasion, he could not authorize the release of the panzers on his own authority. Only Hitler could do that. And Hitler was asleep. Jodl decided not to wake the Führer. The situation would become clearer by daylight, he reasoned. There was no need to disturb Hitler's rest until more was known. Better to wait, to gather more information, to be certain before making such a momentous decision. It was a decision that would haunt Germany for the rest of the war. While Jodl waited and Hitler slept, the first waves of Allied infantry were already approaching the beaches. At 6:30 in the morning, the seaborne landings began. American soldiers hit Utah and Omaha beaches on the western end of the invasion zone. British and Canadian troops stormed Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches to the east. The Atlantic Wall, the fortress that was supposed to hold for years, was being breached in a single morning. At Utah Beach, the landings went almost miraculously well. Strong currents pushed the landing craft nearly 2,000 yards south of the intended beach, but this proved fortunate. The actual landing zone was less heavily defended than the planned one. By mid-morning, American troops were pushing inland with light casualties. At Omaha Beach, it was a different story. This was the most heavily defended beach, with high bluffs overlooking the sand and German strongpoints positioned to create murderous crossfire. The preliminary bombardment had done little damage to the bunkers. Many of the amphibious tanks that were supposed to support the infantry sank in the rough seas. The first waves of American soldiers walked into a killing ground. Machine gun fire from the bluffs cut them down as they waded through the surf. Artillery shells exploded among the landing craft. Bodies littered the waterline. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. General Omar Bradley, watching from offshore, seriously considered evacuating the beach. But the Americans did not break. Small groups of soldiers, led by sergeants and lieutenants who took charge when their officers fell, began finding ways up the bluffs. They blew gaps in the wire. They silenced individual bunkers. By noon, they had gained footholds on the heights. At the British and Canadian beaches, the landings were costly but successful. Specialized armored vehicles, tanks fitted with flails to clear mines and other unusual equipment, helped breach the defenses. By afternoon, British troops were pushing toward Caen, the crucial road junction that Rommel had identified as the key to Normandy. And still no one woke Hitler. And still the panzers did not move. When Hitler finally woke around 10 in the morning, the invasion was already 4 hours old. He received his first full briefing at 11:30. Even then, he was skeptical. He believed the Normandy landings were a diversion. The real attack would come at Pas-de-Calais, just as intelligence had predicted. He refused to release the armoured reserves. His generals tried to convince him otherwise. Rundstedt's staff presented the evidence. This was clearly a major operation, not a raid. Tens of thousands of troops were already ashore. The scale of the naval and air support was unprecedented. This had to be the main invasion. Hitler would not budge. He had made up his mind. The Normandy attack was a feint designed to draw away German forces before the real blow fell at Calais. He would not be tricked. The panzers would stay where they were. Hour after hour passed. The Allies poured men and equipment onto the beaches. The German defenders, without armoured support, fought desperately, but could not throw the invaders back. At Omaha Beach, the crisis was finally contained by early afternoon. The Americans were off the beach and onto the bluffs. The worst was over. Rommel's 24-hour window was slipping away. It was not until around 2 in the afternoon, nearly 8 hours after the landings began, that Hitler finally authorized the release of 2 panzer divisions, the 12th SS and Panzer Lehr. By then, it was far too late. The tanks had to move in daylight, exactly as Rommel had predicted. Allied aircraft controlled the skies. Thousands of fighter bombers and medium bombers were flying support missions over Normandy. The moment German armor began moving, they would be spotted and attacked. And that is exactly what happened. Panzer Lehr Division, one of the finest armoured formations in the German army, began its march toward Normandy in the afternoon. The roads were clogged with traffic. Allied aircraft pounced on the column. Bombs and rockets tore into the tanks and trucks. The division lost 5 tanks, 84 half-tracks and self-propelled guns, and over 130 trucks and fuel bozers before it ever reached the front. By the time it arrived, exhausted and depleted, the battle for the beaches was already over. Only one panzer division managed to launch any significant counterattack on D-Day itself. The 21st Panzer Division was positioned near Caen, close enough to the beaches to respond without travelling far. It was the only armoured formation in position to do what Rommel had demanded, to strike the invaders while they were still vulnerable. But even the 21st Panzer was paralysed by the command chaos. Its commander, Major General Edgar Feuchtinger, had been absent when the invasion began. He was reportedly in Paris, away from his headquarters without notifying his staff. No one knew where he was. No one could give the orders to attack. When Feuchtinger finally returned in the morning, the division still could not move. It was under the command of Army Group B, which meant it needed Rommel's authorization. But Rommel was in Germany. His chief of staff, Speidel, had to coordinate with multiple headquarters, none of which had clear authority. The division spent the morning fighting British paratroopers near the Orne bridges, drawing blood but accomplishing nothing decisive. It was not until nearly noon that General Erich Marx, the corps commander, managed to get authority to redirect the 21st Panzer toward the beaches. But even then, the division was ordered to attack in the wrong direction. First it moved west, toward Caen's center, then was redirected north toward the coast. The tanks had to thread through the rubble-strewn streets of Caen, wasting hours while the British consolidated their positions. It was late afternoon before the 21st Panzer finally attacked toward Sword Beach. The panzers pushed through a gap between the British and Canadian beachheads, driving north toward the coast. For a brief moment, they actually reached the sea. German tanks were on the Normandy beaches. They had split the Allied beachhead, but without infantry support, without reinforcements, without a coordinated follow-up, the panzers could not hold what they had gained. British anti-tank guns and tanks engaged them. Naval gunfire crashed down on the exposed armor. The division had to fight just to survive, let alone exploit its success. Then, around 9 in the evening, nearly 600 Allied transport aircraft thundered overhead, carrying reinforcements to the British airborne troops east of the Orne. Feuchtinger, watching the massive air armada pass over his positions, panicked. He believed his forces were about to be cut off by a new airborne landing. He ordered a retreat. The aircraft were actually heading away from his position, toward drop zones to the east. There was no threat of encirclement, but Feuchtinger did not know that. He saw the sky filled with enemy aircraft and assumed the worst. The only German armoured counterattack of D-Day ended in withdrawal. The one division that had reached the beach pulled back inland. The opportunity was gone. While all this was happening, Rommel was still in Germany. Speidel had called him at his home early in the morning with news of the landings. Rommel immediately prepared to return to France, but the journey would take hours. He could not fly because Allied aircraft controlled the skies. Any German plane over northern France would be shot down. He had to drive 600 kilometers on roads that might themselves be targeted by Allied bombers. Rommel spent D-Day in his car, racing back toward Normandy, listening to fragmentary radio reports of the disaster unfolding on the beaches. There was nothing he could do. Every decision that mattered had to be made without him. Every opportunity that arose slipped away while he was still on the road. By the time he arrived at La Roche-Guyon that evening, tens of thousands of Allied troops were already ashore. The 5 beachheads were beginning to link up. The Atlantic wall had been pierced in a single day. Rommel understood immediately what this meant. He had said it himself. The first 24 hours would be decisive. Those 24 hours were now over. The Allies had not been thrown back into the sea. They had gained a foothold. And from that foothold, they would never be dislodged. "How stupid of me," Rommel muttered as he reviewed the situation. "How stupid of me." The phrase echoed what he had said throughout the long drive back to France. He had been away when it mattered most. He had trusted the weather forecasters. He had gone to give his wife a pair of grey suede shoes, while his soldiers died on the beaches without their commander. In the days and weeks that followed, Rommel fought with everything he had. He rushed reinforcements to the front. He personally visited the forward positions, rallying his troops, directing counterattacks. He was everywhere, driving himself as relentlessly as he had driven the Atlantic Wall construction, trying to contain the disaster. But it was all a holding action now. The moment for victory had passed. The window had closed. By June 12th, the Allied beachheads had merged into a continuous front 80 kilometers wide. More than 326,000 troops were in France, with more arriving every day. Artillery, tanks, ammunition, fuel, food, everything needed for a modern army was flowing across the beaches, and through the artificial mulberry harbours the Allies had towed across the Channel. The battle for Caen dragged on for weeks. The city that was supposed to fall on D-Day itself was not completely liberated until mid-July, but this was a tactical success that meant nothing strategically. The Allies had achieved what mattered. They had established themselves in France. They had created a front that the Germans could not break. Rommel met with Hitler on June 17th at a command bunker near Margival in northern France. It was a tense, difficult meeting. Rommel tried to explain the reality of the situation. The front could not hold. The Allies had overwhelming superiority in men, tanks, aircraft, and supplies. Every day the situation grew worse. Germany should seek a political solution, Rommel argued. The war in the West was lost. Continuing to fight would only prolong the suffering without changing the outcome. Hitler refused to listen. He ranted about new wonder weapons, the V-1 rockets, that would turn the tide by terrorizing England. He insisted the Wehrmacht hold its positions without retreat. He would hear nothing of negotiation or surrender. The word defeat did not exist in his vocabulary. Rommel left the meeting knowing that Hitler had lost touch with reality. The Führer lived in a fantasy world where wonder weapons and willpower could overcome material facts. Germany was going to lose the war, and Hitler would not admit it. On July 17, 1944, Rommel was returning from an inspection of the front lines near Caen. His staff car was travelling along a road near Saint-Foy-de-Montgomery when Allied fighter planes spotted it. 2 Spitfires dove on the vehicle, strafing it with machine gun fire. The driver was killed instantly. Rommel was thrown from the car with severe head and facial injuries. His skull was fractured in 3 places. His left eye socket was crushed. For hours, it was unclear whether he would survive. He survived, but his war was over. He was evacuated to a hospital, then sent home to Herlingen to recover. He would never command troops again. 3 days after Rommel was wounded, on July 20th, a group of German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb planted at his East Prussian headquarters, the Wolfschanze, or Wolf's Lair. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg carried a briefcase containing explosives into a conference with Hitler, placed it under the table, and left the room. The bomb exploded. 4 men were killed, but Hitler survived with only minor injuries. A heavy oak table leg had shielded him from the worst of the blast. The Gestapo launched a massive investigation, arresting and executing thousands. Everyone connected to the conspiracy was hunted down. Confessions were extracted through torture. Names were named. Rommel's name came up during the interrogations. Several conspirators mentioned him. Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, the military governor of France, muttered Rommel's name repeatedly after a failed suicide attempt. Caesar von Hofacker, Stülpnagel's aide, named Rommel under torture as someone who had known about the plot and was sympathetic to it. Karl Goerdeler, the civilian leader of the resistance, had included Rommel on a list of potential government leaders after Hitler's death. Rommel was named as a possible president of a post-Nazi Germany. The evidence was fragmentary and contradictory. Historians still debate how much Rommel actually knew about the assassination plot and whether he supported it. He may have agreed that Hitler should be removed from power while opposing assassination. He may have known more than he admitted. The truth died with the conspirators. But Hitler had heard enough. Rommel was implicated. The Desert Fox, the hero of North Africa, the most popular general in Germany, was a traitor. On October 14, 1944, 2 generals from Hitler's headquarters arrived at Rommel's home in Herlingen. General Wilhelm Burgdorf and General Ernst Maisel came with an ultimatum from the Führer. Rommel could face trial before the People's Court, the Nazi tribunal that had already condemned hundreds of the July 20th conspirators to death by hanging. The trial would be public. The evidence against him would be presented. His family would suffer disgrace. His staff would be arrested and likely executed. The verdict was certain. He would be hanged like the others, his body displayed as a warning. Or Rommel could take poison. If he chose suicide, his death would be announced as the result of his injuries from the July strafing attack. He would receive a state funeral with full military honours. His family would be protected. His reputation would remain intact. Germany would mourn a hero, not condemn a traitor. Burgdorf had brought a cyanide capsule. Hitler's orders were clear. If Rommel chose poison, he was to take it immediately. The generals would wait. Rommel called his 15-year-old son, Manfred, to his side. The boy had been given leave from his anti-aircraft battery to visit his recovering father. Now he learned that his father was about to die. To die at the hands of one's own people is hard, Rommel told his son. But the house is surrounded, and Hitler is charging me with high treason. Manfred asked if they could fight, defend themselves, escape. Rommel shook his head. There is no point, he said. It is better for one to die than for all of us to die in a gunfight. Rommel went upstairs to say goodbye to his wife Lucy. I will die in 15 minutes, he told her. On behalf of the Führer, I am given a choice. Either poison myself or appear before the People's Court. He put on his Africa Corps jacket, the uniform he had worn in his days of glory in the desert. He took his field marshal's baton. He walked out of the house, accompanied by Manfred and his adjutant Hermann Aldinger, stopping once so that his beloved dachshund would not try to follow him. Rommel shook hands with his son and his old friend. He climbed into the general's car. The driver, an SS man, started the engine. The car drove away toward a quiet spot outside the village. 20 minutes later, the phone rang at the Rommel house. Aldinger answered. Field Marshal Rommel had died. The Nazi regime announced that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had died of complications from his war wounds. He was given a lavish state funeral in Ulm on October 18th. His casket was draped with the Nazi war flag. His helmet and marshal's baton lay on top. Senior Nazi officials attended. Hitler sent a wreath with a message praising Rommel's service to Germany. The German people mourned a hero. They did not know their hero had been murdered by the regime he served. The truth remained hidden until after the war. Only then, when the survivors began to speak, did the world learn how Rommel had really died, and why. History remembers D-Day as a triumph, and it was. The courage of the Allied soldiers who stormed those beaches under withering fire was extraordinary. Young men, many of them barely out of their teens, waded through surf, churned red with blood, climbed bluffs swept by machine gun fire, and kept advancing when every instinct screamed at them to hide. They won the war that day, though the fighting would continue for another 11 months. The planning and coordination of the invasion was a masterpiece of military logistics, moving 156,000 men across a hostile sea, landing them on defended beaches, supporting them with naval gunfire and air cover, supplying them with everything they needed to fight and survive. All of this required organization on a scale never before attempted. The deception operations that convinced Hitler the main attack would come at Pas de Calais were brilliant. Operation Fortitude created an entire phantom army that existed only in German intelligence reports. Double agents fed false information. Fake radio traffic suggested movements that never happened. Inflatable tanks sat in fields where German reconnaissance aircraft would photograph them. The deception held not just through D-Day but for weeks afterward, keeping German reserves pinned at Calais while the real beachhead grew stronger. But D-Day was also a story of German failure. Failure of intelligence, failure of command, failure of decision. The defenders had the forces to stop the invasion. They had the soldiers, the tanks, the artillery. What they lacked was the ability to use them in time. Rommel had seen it all coming. He had understood that the first 24 hours would be decisive. He had begged for the authority to mass his forces at the water's edge, to position the panzers close enough to counterattack immediately, to strike the Allies before they could establish a foothold. He had warned that any delay would be fatal. He had predicted that armoured reserves held inland would be destroyed by Allied aircraft before they could reach the battle. He had said, over and over, that the war would be won or lost on the beaches, in the first hours, before the sun set on the longest day. And then, on the one day when his presence was most critical, he was not there. He was 600 kilometers away, celebrating his wife's birthday, because the weather forecasters said no invasion was possible. The Germans intercepted the coded message that warned the invasion was imminent. They did not act on it properly. The warning went to the wrong army. The commanders who received it dismissed its importance. Hitler slept through the crucial hours when the panzers could have been unleashed. His staff would not wake him. Jodl made the decision to wait, to gather more information, to be certain. By the time Hitler was awake and briefed and finally convinced, the opportunity had passed. The armoured reserve sat motionless, waiting for an order that came 8 hours too late. When the order finally came, the tanks moved in daylight and were slaughtered from the air, exactly as Rommel had predicted. The only division that managed to counterattack reached the beach and then withdrew, spooked by an air armada that was not even coming for them. 24 hours. That was all Germany had. Rommel had said it plainly, standing on that empty beach in April, waving his marshal's baton at the sand. The first 24 hours will be decisive. The fate of Germany depends on the outcome. For the Allies, as well as Germany, it will be the longest day. He was right. And because the German High Command could not act decisively in those 24 hours, because Hitler would not release the panzers, because no one would wake the Führer, because Rommel himself was away from his post for a birthday party, the invasion succeeded. Within 11 months, Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Adolf Hitler was dead by his own hand in a bunker beneath Berlin. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. What might have happened if things had been different? What if Rommel had stayed at his headquarters? What if Hitler had been awake when the first reports came in? What if the panzers had been released at dawn instead of mid-afternoon? Military historians have debated these questions for 80 years. Some believe a more aggressive German response could have thrown the Allies back into the sea, or at least contained them in a narrow beachhead that could have been destroyed piecemeal. Others argue that Allied air and naval superiority made German victory impossible, regardless of what happened on the ground. The weight of metal, the sheer mass of resources the Allies could bring to bear, would have overwhelmed any defence eventually. What is certain is that D-Day was a very close-run thing. At Omaha Beach, the outcome hung in the balance for hours. A well-timed armoured counterattack, delivered in the morning instead of the late afternoon, might have made the difference. The gap between Juno and Sword beaches was real. The 21st Panzer Division actually reached the coast. With proper support, with coordinated follow-up, that breakthrough might have been exploited. But none of that happened. The decisions were made or not made. The orders were given or not given. The tanks moved or did not move. The Führer slept or woke. The Field Marshal was there or was not there. And when the sun set on June 6, 1944, the Allied beachheads were secure. The longest day was over, and Germany had lost its last chance to win the war. Rommel's grave is in Herlingen, the village where he died. His wife Lucy lived until 1971, never remarrying, keeping her husband's memory alive. Their son Manfred went on to a distinguished career in German politics, serving as mayor of Stuttgart from 1974 to 1996. He became a respected figure in post-war Germany, helping to rebuild the nation his father had fought for. Manfred Rommel died in 2013 at the age of 84. The chateau at Roche-Guyon still stands, overlooking the Seine River. You can visit Rommel's office, walk the tunnels, his staff dug into the cliffs behind the castle, stand where he stood when he looked out at the rose garden and thought about the invasion that was coming. The Rochefoucauld family still owns the property. History has not displaced them. The beaches of Normandy are quiet now. The bunkers are silent, their guns rusted and cold. The tides roll in and out, erasing the footprints of tourists who walk the sand where so many men died 80 years ago. Cemetery after cemetery marks the landscape, white crosses and stars of David stretching in perfect rows toward the horizon. But the lesson of D-Day endures. 24 hours. That was all the time there was. Rommel knew it. He said it plainly, standing on that empty beach with his marshal's baton, staring out at the grey waters of the Channel. And because no one listened, because no one acted, because one man slept while history hung in the balance, the outcome was decided in those 24 hours. Some moments cannot be recovered. Some opportunities, once missed, never return. The first 24 hours of D-Day were such a moment. For Germany, those hours were the last chance to change the course of the war. They let that chance slip away, and the longest day became the beginning of the end. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for keeping these stories alive.